Asa Winstanley is an investigative journalist who lives in London. At the Electronic Intifada, he is associate editor and co-host of their podcast. He has also written for many other publications over the years, including Declassified UK, Middle East Monitor, Al Akbar English of Lebanon, Middle East Eye, the Jerusalem Media and Communication Center, and Freedom. His latest book, Weaponising Antisemitism: How the Israel Lobby Brought Down Jeremy Corbyn, will be available in all good bookshops on 30th of May, and it's the focus of our discussion today. Asa Winstanley, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Asa,
great to be with you.
So just to get straight in, who would you say is the target audience of your book? Who do you hope will pick up your book and be informed by it?
Well, I would say I wrote the book for anyone who likes a good true crime book, basically, because that's how I saw it. That's how I saw what was done to Jeremy Corbyn. It was a crime, and I tried to make this an engaging read, which told the story in as accessible a manner as possible, while still being, incredibly well researched. If I do say so myself, but I say in the book as well, I explain that this is based on years of reporting that I did for the Electronic Intifada mostly, and everything we did there, and all our articles that we do there are fact-checked. So it's, when I'm complimenting the research, it was a team effort. So yeah, it's detailed and comprehensive while being accessible and like a thriller, and some of the early reviews are saying that.
I would agree with that as well. You do mention in the opening chapters that Electronic Intifada is recognized as setting the narrative around, these claims of anti-Semitism against Jeremy Corbyn. So for anyone who's, you could say, partially informed and curious, or completely confused about how Jeremy Corbyn could be taken down on the single topic of anti-Semitism, this is really the book for you. It flows so well. It really does read as a crime novel. Now that you mention it, it's not just a dense informational kind of book. It does read very, very smoothly. And now I'm also curious about, in terms of when people think about politics, when people think particularly about political parties, we're used to thinking them as a machine. They've been around for ages. They tick along in their own way. And if you're not a part of that machine, if you're not part of that party, if you're not a member, etc., there's no impact. Like, no, the lay Britain has no impact on what a political party's machine is doing. But you mentioned, for example, you pointed out a really effective point, that PSC, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, they had a timely intervention of supplying thousands of Palestinian flags to the 2018 Labour conference. And what that did was that it helped turn the tide of acceptability towards supporting the Palestinian cause. So do other examples come to mind? Like, if we're thinking about people outside of the Labour Party machine who want to, for the sake of Palestine, just legitimize the cause, normalize the cause, and so on. Have any other examples come to mind?
Well, I think that the Jeremy Corbyn movement in general is a kind of example of that when it started. What you described there is absolutely the case. That is normally how British political parties sort of tick along without any kind of really involvement, or as they would see it nowadays, interference from the general public. That they, generally speaking, don't want the involvement of the general public. They want a kind of political elite. But Jeremy Corbyn represented a break with that it was a mass movement, that there was a mass movement behind him, and people, campaigners and wider audiences from various different causes who Jeremy Corbyn had supported over the years, whether it's anti-racism, Palestine solidarity, equal rights, against Islamophobia, against anti-refugee sort of sentiment and racism, all these kind of different projects, the anti-war movement, all the people involved in those kind of things and the mass movements behind those kind of things, then in 2015, 2016, began entering the Labour Party or re-entering the Labour Party. In many cases, people who had left the Labour Party out of disillusionment. And, we saw the prospect of the Labour Party becoming a kind of mass movement. And the Labour Party, when the Labour Party had been really started to be hollowed out over the years under the Tony Blair years. And at the height of what you could call the Corbynist movement, the Corbynistas, Corbynite movement, whatever. I know Jeremy Corbyn himself doesn't like such phrases, but his supporters in one way or another. At the height of it, there was approaching 600,000 people in the Labour Party. Well, now that's plummeted again now that he's out of the Labour Party. People have been driven out of the party in one way or another, whether they've been expelled or they've sort of left in disgust and been driven out because that's what the new Labour leadership want. In one way or another, the membership has plummeted again. And there's a part of the book towards the end where I do mention that Labour's now, I think she's Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeve, certainly in the Shadow Cabinet. She had an interview with the Financial Times in which she said that it's good that she heard the news that as at least 150,000 people have left the Labour Party or been driven out of the Labour Party, expelled, suspended, whatever, from the Labour Party since Jeremy Corbyn was kicked out as a Labour MP. And she said that was actually a good thing. Now, she claimed it was to make good for what she called, I think it was the stain of anti-Semitism. But really what this book exposes is that was really a pretext to kind of remove mass involvement and mass in socialist politics in this country.
It's like an attempt to control the echo chamber kind of thing. That was my take on it, because when you go into, in your book, you comprehensively outline how papers like the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News, which are openly pro-Israel, they are definitely trying to feed into the echo chamber of politics. They laid the groundwork for other news outlets to question Corbyn on single causes like anti-Semitism. So when we see situations like that, outlets like the Jewish Chronicle, Jewish News, they're laying the groundwork against a potential, whoever the next Jeremy Corbyn is, hopefully. What could be done? Like you outlined very comprehensively how they did such an effective job. Is there a counter, or is this the nature of politics? It's all about the echo chamber. Is there a way that their efforts to oversimplify one political figure with a great history of activism and such a diverse history as well, like Jeremy Corbyn, he got narrowed down onto anti-Semitism? Is there anything that those of us who, whether it's supporting Palestine or other causes, is there any way we can just break that a bit?
Well, I think what the Corbyn years show is that the only way to defeat a smear campaign is to openly call it out as a smear that it was, and to fight against it. And unfortunately, Jeremy Corbyn's team didn't do that. They didn't do it effectively. They didn't do it really at all. They didn't say that it was a smear. And actually, by the end, Corbyn's people were going along with the Labour Party bureaucracy, which was expelling people and suspending people, disciplining members who did say that it was a smear campaign. And so there was it was a real problem in that way. And we saw Corbyn's team during his tenure as Labour Party leader. All the other smears, or most of the other smears that were tried against him, they did fight back, and they did fight back quite effectively. So, for example, when Corbyn was smeared as, a spy for the Czech, the Czech communist government during the Cold War, and as an IRA sympathizer, and all these kind of things. None of them gained the traction that the Labour anti-Semitism smears did. And I argue in the book, and I lay out the evidence for why in the book, that the reason that it gained so much traction was because Corbyn's team did not fight against it effectively, and that it needs to be called out. So that the answer to the question is, look, if you fight back against a smear, you might not win, but if you don't fight back, you can guarantee you're going to lose. And unfortunately, Corbyn's team played this kind of political game where they said, okay, well, there was false allegations of anti-Semitism, and instead of saying these are false allegations of anti-Semitism, this is not anti-Semitic what's been said, it's Palestine, it's anti-Zionism, it's against Zionism, it's against the pro-Israel lobby, whatever it was. Instead of saying this is not anti-Semitism, he then apologized for anti-Semitism. So the problem with that is, if you give this general condemnation of anti-Semitism, okay, fine, Jeremy Corbyn said he said repeatedly, time and time again, anti-Semitism is a terrible thing, and so on and so forth. Well, who can disagree with that? Of course, that's correct. But if you're just saying that anti-Semitism is we condemn anti-Semitism, the general message that the general public is going to get is that, well, he's condemning anti-Semitism, but there must be some sort of problem here if he keeps saying it over and over again. Whereas instead, he should have put out the message that this is not true, what's being said. When Margaret Hodge, for example, the right-wing Labour MP, says that I'm a fucking racist and anti-Semite, that's a complete lie. And she's only saying that because she's opposed to my politics, because I'm on the left of the party, and because I'm pro-Palestinian, and she is one of the Labour Friends of Israel. So unfortunately, that wasn't done for various reasons, and I talk about some of them in the book.
When papers like Jewish Chronicle and Jewish News put out that smear, that is quite straightforward. As you pointed out, it's up to the leadership to show leadership and just point them out as smears. There are also charities like the CST, Community Security Trust, Community Security Trust. Those are much tougher to counter, I would imagine, because they're a charity, they've got a reputation. Their objective is to protect the Jewish community. So if such a charity, such a community institution says that such an individual is enabling or is an anti-Semite, and yet at the same time, the weakness in such institutions is that they also have a track record of being politically motivated, of being pro-Israel and so on. Is that also something that it's just down to the leadership to go to counter the smear, or is there something a little bit more holistic around the Charity Commission giving more scrutiny to charities like the CST and other Israel-leaning charities and so on? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, as you mentioned, yes, the CST is a pro-Israel group, so it portrays itself, and to an extent, it does have a role in monitoring anti-Semitism. Yeah, that is what its mandate is as a charity, is to work against anti-Jewish prejudice. But it also has this, as you said, political role of defending Israel, lobbying for Israel, combating boycotts of Israel. It's a CST, one of the leading CST spokespeople. I think it was last year on Twitter, put out a tweet with a photo of a Palestine solidarity protest, and it said something along the lines of supporting the Intifada, and he said that was anti-Semitism. Well, Intifada is just Arabic for uprising. It just means an uprising, and so in the Palestinian context, that's an uprising against the military occupation, the occupation and oppression of the Palestinians. So an intifada, in that sense, is something to be absolutely supported. And instead, this CST figure, was portraying it as anti-Jewish in some way, that this was threatening to Jews, which is completely untrue.
Mm.
And so that is just yet another example of how the CST is really a pro-Israel lobby group, and I get into that in some detail in the book. And I think, yeah, you're right in a sense that it's difficult when you've got officially recognized charities like the CST, who portray themselves as the representatives of the whole Jewish community in Britain, or even though that's not the case. And they do have an inside track with the government. Their advice is taken extremely seriously by the British government, and they work with government departments, and they work with the Labour Party as well. So yes, it's very difficult, but I mean, it depends on what your audience is. And unfortunately, I think by the end of the Corbyn era, he himself and certainly his team were playing a kind of political. They were trying to play the political game, where it was completely rigged against them, because the British political system is not in favor of mass movements for socialism, and it's always going to be rigged against them, mass popular movements. And so, unfortunately, by the end, they were trying to appeal to this kind of political elite more than rather than appealing to their mass base, which they should have done. And when they did do that, appeal to their mass base, it was effective. It worked. Like, for example, during the 2017 election campaign, there was the Manchester bombing. And, some people on the left, when that happened, thought, "Oh, that's it. We're gonna lose the election now, because Jeremy Corbyn is seen as an anti-war candidate, because he is an anti-war candidate, and so therefore he'll be seen as weak on this kind of thing." So Corbyn could have just, if he could have just come out, the temptation must have been to just come out and play the kind of just sort of condemn terrorism and say this is terrible. Who can disagree with that? Of course, it was a terrible bombing, but instead of just doing that, the normal kind of mainstream political, status quo kind
playing
of
the political game,
playing the political game. Instead of doing that, he came out and he said, this is a terrible atrocity, and the responsibility for the atrocity is with the people who did it. But also, if we have to look at the root causes of such atrocities, which are Britain and America's wars in the Middle East. That was the line he came out with, and that was really successful. And then that was polls after that. Corbyn made that speech, showed that that people agreed with that. That it was just a common sense line, really, because people were against the war in Iraq and so forth. And so, unfortunately, he didn't do that when it came to the anti-Semitism smears. He didn't say, look, these attacks for anti-Semitism are coming about because they're false allegations of anti-Semitism targeting me and my supporters because we support the Palestinian cause. And he should have just come out and said that. It might not have been successful, but by not doing it, he guaranteed that he wasn't successful.
So concessions don't ever, don't always work, and in this case, they definitely didn't. And in your closing chapters, you said that Corbyn's concessions had gotten him nowhere. So if, like, let's say that another pro-Palestinian MP, the next Jeremy Corbyn, hopefully, becomes leader of Labour or any other party ever again, is the only way for them to retain the leadership and thus fulfill the mandate that they were elected leader of that party for, is the only way to maintain that leadership for them to purge Zionists from their ranks, similar to how Keir Starmer is currently purging pro-Palestinian supporters from their ranks? Is the Israel lobby too much of I think the phrase is fifth column within the ranks of a party to be able to be relied upon if you yourself as a leader are pro-Palestinian?
I think it would. You'd want to create the kind of political party that Zionists wouldn't want to join in the first place, that was in favor of the Palestinians, that was in solidarity with the Palestinians, that supported, liberation of Palestine, and that Zionists wouldn't want to join in the first place, really. And I don't think we're ever going to see that kind of party in the Labour Party. That's that. Like, there was a brief opening where, there was an opportunity to create an anti-imperialist, anti-racist political party out of the Labour Party, from within the Labour Party. The Corbyn movement did create that sort of brief opening, but I think that opportunity is now well and truly gone. Like, there's no way that they're ever going to allow something like the Jeremy Corbyn phenomenon to ever come back to the leadership of the Labour Party. It's just never going to happen. We're seeing, the left being comprehensively purged from the Labour Party, and Corbyn really now is just a backbencher. And with all due respect to him, but he doesn't have any. He's not, technically a Labour member, a normal member of the Labour Party, but he's not a Labour member of Parliament. He's an independent member of Parliament. But despite that, despite his marginal role in that sense, in terms of the mainstream, again, like I said, with all due respect to him, despite that, the right of the Labour Party and the pro-Israel lobby is still obsessed by him, is obsessed by kicking him while he's down. And that is to send a kind of object lesson to everybody else, that to make sure nothing like that can ever happen again in the Labour Party, and to make sure that the Israel lobby really maintains their control of the Labour Party's policies when it comes to Palestine.
I would say, if there's any Americans in our audience, a synonymous figure might be Ralph Nader, kicked out of the sort of the left-wing kind of Democrats movement, and just made a pariah. So one of your closing lines is, unfortunately, Corbyn and his supporters had not been prepared for a very Israeli coup. So, in your opinion, would a victory for Starmer's Labour, as it currently is right now, would that election victory, hypothetically, be a coup for Israel?
Yeah, I think it would. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, an election victory for the Conservatives would also be a coup for Israel, because the Israel lobby's got such a massive amount of influence in both of the main parties. And willingly so, they give it to them willingly. They're sort of knocking at an open door. So that line that closes the book about the very Israeli coup refers to the fact that not only the Israel lobby was involved in the kind of long, slow coup against Jeremy Corbyn, but the state of Israel itself, so that at the end, I'm talking about the story of Asaf Kaplan, who was a spy for Israel, who was part of Unit 8200, is the cyber offensive unit of Israel's military intelligence, and he was employed in 2021. He was hired by the Labour Party, by Keir Starmer's Labour Party, to work on what's called social listening. And so, I argue in the conclusion of the book that it was no longer necessary for the Israel lobby to intervene. To infiltrate. That's the word I'm looking for. It was no longer necessary for the Israel lobby to infiltrate the Labour Party, because they were being invited in the front door, being hired inside. And so, it's a real kind of threat. It's the kind of thing that, if Corbyn had, against the odds, been successful and had become a leader and had been elected as the prime minister, it's the kind of thing that would be a national security threat, that you've got a hostile foreign power, Israel, intervening against what would have been the prime minister of a foreign country. And so, that is certainly a national security threat. But it depends on how you define national security, because the way I would define national security is the security of the people. But the British deep state, the permanent military security apparatus, which is not subject to any kind of democratic control, and has an immense amount of interest in how this country runs and operates, and never changes in terms of its establishment, MI5, MI6, military, and so forth. They are definitely on board with the Israel lobby for the most part, and they also oppose Jeremy Corbyn, and that's something I got into in the first chapter of the book. People can read about that in the first chapter of the book, about how, as soon as Corbyn started to look like a serious contender in the 2015 Labour leadership election, there was signals put out by the British deep state, by the British military, that he shouldn't do it, and then if he did become prime minister, he would be overthrown. So, for example, there was a story, we could say, planted in the Sunday Times in 2015, in which they said a senior serving British military general said that if Corbyn was to become prime minister, there would be effectively a mutiny and there would be mass resignations. People would not essentially take orders from Jeremy Corbyn as prime minister because, he's anti-war. He's in favor of freedom for Palestinians, equal rights for Palestinians, right of return for Palestinians, all these issues that they don't want to see, especially on foreign policy and war. They wanted him to be overthrown. So, there's this novel from the 80s by the former left-wing MP Chris Mullin, A Very British Coup. And, I think what we did see against Jeremy Corbyn was a very Israeli coup, because it did have the involvement of the actual state of Israel in addition to the Israel lobby.
And just ending with my last question, more of a general point, and for your general thoughts. Like we see Zionists supporting nationalists like Tommy Robinson, and we see Israel being held up as an example of an ideal ethno-state by so-called identitarians. And of course, there's your book, which details how Zionists hijacked the most leftist Labour leader that at least I've seen in my lifetime. Could these be indicators that Zionism's present and future needs to break the historic connection that the Jewish community had with leftist movements, and thus further proof of how Zionism as a political ideology, it's hijacked the needs and priorities of the Jewish community that it claims to defend?
Yeah, Zionism has hijacked the Jewish community. That's absolutely the case. That I get into that point in my book, that the British academic Paul Kellerman wrote a really interesting book that I cite in my book called The British Left and Zionism, History of a Divorce. And he gets into the whole history, which I, to a lesser extent get into in the book, about how the British left, once upon a time, the British left was very pro-Israel. For the most part, it was very pro-Israel. And it was and before Israel was even established on the mass graves of the Palestinians in 1948, the Zionist movement, the British left, was in support of that. And that is because the British left, especially the Labour Party, was pro-imperialist at that time. The Labour Party was not only pro-imperialist, but it actually ran the British Empire. It was in control of the British Empire when it was in government, and it didn't dismantle it for the most part. There's a mixed record in that regard, but the Labour Party was certainly very pro-imperialist, and its support for Israel and its support for Zionism before Israel was founded was part of that kind of pro-imperialism, essentially, and its Labour Party's colonial history. And Paul Kellerman argues, and we see this from other historians, that one of the three main Zionism was founded on what he calls three conquests, and one the conquests, two of those conquests are quite well known. So there was the conquest of land, the conquest of labor, and the conquest of communities. The conquest of land, of course, was the physical conquest of Palestine, taking it away from the indigenous Palestinian inhabitants, majority Muslim and Christian, and others. Yes, there was a small Jewish community before Zionism who lived as Palestinians, as Arabs, and spoke Arabic and so forth. So there was the conquest of land, the physical conquest, colonization of land, taking it away from the Palestinians, building settlements. But there was the conquest of labor. So that meant that the first wave of physical conquest of Zionism in the late 19th century, although they took over the land, often, sometimes buying it from absentee landlords and so forth. They took over the land, but the actual workers on the land ended up being Palestinians, because they didn't, at that time, Zionism was a very marginal force, and they didn't have the manpower. And these were Europeans for the most part, European Jews coming from Europe. They didn't have the experience to, be farmers on that land, and it was not their country. So they didn't work on the land. And so the Palestinian Arabs were the actual physical workers. And so the second wave of Zionism then implemented what was called the conquest of labor, which meant that the Palestinian, what's called fellahin in Arabic, peasants is kind of a rough translation, but the itinerant
the peasant
agricultural,
farmers?
the peasant farmers, the itinerant agricultural workers on that land. They had, before Zionism came along, they held those small holdings, and then when they were removed by the first wave, often they were employed as those as workers for a new tenant, which was these Zionist settlements. But then the second, as I said, the second wave of colonization, the second wave of Zionist conquest was to conquer the labor. And so as more and more Jewish settlers came from Europe, they then replaced the Palestinians, even as the workers on those lands, and those Palestinian fellahin were thrown off of their land altogether, and they became landless. And which was one of the main driving factors between successive revolts against the British occupation, as it was at the time, and the Zionist settlers.
Because the British enabled everything to happen.
Absolutely, yes. There's a whole history here we don't have time to get into.
Yeah.
But the British Empire, occupied Palestine in 1917, 1918 during the First World War, and they then enabled the colonization by the Zionist movement of Palestine and takeover of Palestine by the Zionist movement. And this, so they then revolted and so forth. So the first conquest was the land, second conquest was the labor, but the third conquest was the conquest of communities. And so what's meant by that, and this is, by the way, not Paul Kellerman's description, not his word, he's just bringing it out, right? That was the Zionist own language. Conquest of land, conquest of labor, conquest of communities. What's meant by that is the conquest of Jewish communities in Europe, for the most regard in Europe. But what that meant was that before the 1940s, Zionism was very much a minority current within the Jewish population. It was a marginal movement. Zionism was not supported by most Jews. It was only after the conquest of Palestine and that Zionism became a useful colonial tool for the British Empire and so forth, that the institutions of the Jewish community in Britain and America started to become more and more pro-Zionist. And it, even I mentioned it in my book, even the Jewish Chronicle, the pro-Israel, the rabidly pro-Israel right-wing newspaper, you could say today, in the 19th century, it was anti-Zionist. It was an anti-Zionist newspaper. The Board of Deputies of British Jews, the leading pro-Israel organization in Britain today, up until the 1940s, was anti-Zionist. And so what was necessary was for the Zionist movement to take over these organizations. Paul Kellerman gets into the history of how that was done. But we certainly see that as something that has happened and something that is a problem within this country today, definitely.
The reason I felt that question was important to ask is because once one understands that Zionism and Judaism are not the same thing, anti-Semitism cannot be weaponized anymore. The bullet has been taken out of the gun, to use a metaphor. Once people understand criticizing Israel, criticizing Zionism as a political ideology, it's not the same thing as criticizing Judaism or being anti-Semitic. Weaponizing Antisemitism will be widely published, widely available in bookshops on 30th of May. If you want an early copy, get it from allbooks.com. And ebook versions are also available for download. Asa, please tell us, what are the best ways of following your work online?
Okay, so all my articles come out on my Substack, asawinstanley.substack.com. So, you can subscribe there either for free or for a monthly or yearly fee to support my work and get access to exclusive bonus content. So you can sign up there and see all my work, and that will come out to your email inbox. I'm also on Twitter, so asawinstanley.substack.com and at Asa Winstanley on Twitter. So, yeah.
Thank you, Asa. I look forward to speaking with you again.
Thanks.